Hello and welcome everyone to to this session of İLEM Istanbul Talks. Our speaker today, Samir Mahmoud, is going to speak on an introduction to Islamic aesthetics, beauty, and visual culture, a few preliminary methodological and theoretical issues. Before we begin, just a very brief introduction about our speaker today. But first of all, my name is Emin Lelic. I'm a professor of history at Salisbury University. Our speaker this evening, Dr. Samir Mahmoud, is currently academic director of Usul Academy. He's also program manager of the diploma in Islamic psychology at the Cambridge Muslim College. He has a BA in anthropology and politics and an MA in architectural history, theory, and urban design from the University of New South Wales, Sydney, Australia. He also holds an MPhil in theology and religious studies with a focus on comparative philosophy and aesthetics. He completed a PhD in Islamic studies from the University of Cambridge under the supervision of Dr. Timothy Winter, Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speaker for this evening, Dr. Mahmoud.
Thank you very much for a very generous introduction. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So, as the title of this presentation suggests, this will be an introduction. And I think the key word here in the title is the word aesthetics itself, because the history of aesthetics is quite interesting. It is a contested term, which means that it is a term that where scholars have serious discussions and controversy over its meaning and what it actually refers to. And so the question we're going to be raising throughout this presentation is, to a certain extent, what is aesthetics, and is there such a thing as an Islamic aesthetics? And then I'm going to raise a few other issues surrounding that question, inshallah. Okay, so when we consider the question of aesthetics, we often think of, or when we think of aesthetics, we often think of things related to art or creativity or beauty. And the term itself, as a modern term, conjures up these images. When you've asked different people, they'll give you slightly different answers. But generally speaking, it's associated with the terms like art, creativity, expression, beauty, etc. And when you think about that, the first thing that comes to mind is, as a scholar, to what extent is this universal, in the sense that aesthetics seem to suggest that all things related to artistic beauty and creation and creativity are lumped together under a single title or a single theme or a single field of investigation. Anyone who's studied history, for example, history of Egyptian art or history of ancient art, will quickly realize that the term aesthetics becomes problematic if used beyond the modern period. So, for example, aesthetics raises the notion of appreciating the outward beautiful form of things, for example. That's one possible way of understanding aesthetics. I'll define that a bit more concretely a little bit later. Now, that's a common understanding of aesthetics today. You go to the Egyptian Museum or the British Museum in London, for example, and you see a stone tablet or a stone from a structure from Egypt with odd symbols like hieroglyphs, and the tourist gawks or gazes at it in order to appreciate its beauty. The question is that how the Egyptians appreciated it and understood it? It's an object of aesthetic consideration for the contemporary viewer, but in ancient Egypt, this would have been located in a temple, a sacred building, or one of the pyramids, so large tomb. Then the hieroglyphs would have symbolized the threshold between this world and the underworld, this world and the next world, for example. And the hieroglyphs would have been enacted within a body of rituals and processions and incantations that brought the entire space to life and animated it. So in the kind of ritualistic context, um, in that kind of spiritual religious context, what is left of our contemporary understanding of aesthetics and the object itself? If we go to ancient Egypt, for example, also, or ancient Greece, for that matter, we do find people who sculpted works of art. We do find people who discussed beauty in philosophy, like Plato. We do find temple architecture. We do find considerations of creativity. But whether or not all these were actually lumped together under a single theme and topic is questionable. Beauty was often discussed in philosophical circles, and sculptor was often considered to be in the lowest rung of society, along with other artists. So they were not considered to be the supreme forms of creative expression in society. Architecture was left to builders and geometers rather than architects as we know them today. The actual term architect didn't exist in those cultures. So there's a lot of things to think about and consider when we think about the term aesthetics. To what extent is it a modern notion? To what extent is it rooted in a particular culture? So let's have a look at some of these. However, Yani, if we think of aesthetics in terms of one of its core concepts or ideas, beauty, then we are on more of a solid footing in terms of investigating what that may look like. For example, in the Quran, we find, and in the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, we find clear references to beauty as something that is extremely important, not only as an attribute of God, but also as something that animates existence. And if we turn to, for example, the writings of someone like Plato, also, again, you find this idea of beauty quite prevalent and dominant. However, in both the Quranic texts and in Plato, beauty is often discussed in a way that it's not really discussed in contemporary aesthetics. And the question is why? So even a single concept or idea like beauty is radically different as it was understood in Plato, or as it was understood in Islamic culture, than the way it is understood today. So something has happened along the way. And let me just tell you a short story about the history of aesthetics. So the term aesthetics itself is of Greek derivation, and it's associated with the senses or things perceived by the senses. Therefore, aesthetics initially had nothing to do with beauty or art. People like Baumgarten and eventually succeeded by Immanuel Kant uh, developed the field of aesthetics as distinct from epistemology and distinct from ethics as a unique field of investigation into the nature of things we perceive through the senses. If you look at the Platonic triad of truth, goodness, and beauty, truth associated with epistemology, goodness associated with ethics, and beauty associated with beauty, the beauty of the world, then the first two had their own distinct philosophical areas of investigation. Truth was associated with epistemology, and goodness was associated with ethics in philosophy. But beauty did not have a distinct philosophical field of investigation. So in the 18th century, philosophers, in the increasing differentiation of various fields of knowledge, developed a distinct field of knowledge that dealt with the things that we perceive through the senses, and eventually it became things we perceive through the senses that are beautiful. So it became gradually associated with beauty, because beauty or beautiful forms are those that most leave their impression on our senses. It's a much more complicated history, of course, but there you have it. Now, by the early 19th century, aesthetics and taste become quite dominant in the cultural life of European thought. And by the late 19th century, when most of the Muslim world, or most of the world, comes under colonial occupation, and many of, or the colonial enterprise or Western enterprise becomes quite dominant globally, many Muslim political entities like the Ottoman Empire or many Muslim lands come under direct impact of colonialism. and not only under the impact of a direct military presence, but also under the sway of its powerful cultural impetus and ideas. And so the late 19th century, in the Ottoman period, for example, you get development of Dar al-Fununs, these kind of academies of knowledge that are modeled on European universities. And you get scholars in the Ottoman period and also in Egypt beginning to translate European terms into Arabic. But it wasn't just a literal translation of a term, because by translating in Arabic a term that doesn't exist in the Arabic language, they were also translating an entire sphere of knowledge and investigation. And so we know for a fact, for example, that the Arabic language does not contain an equivalent to aesthetics. As we just saw, aesthetics is a unique development in the history of European thought as a result of specific cultural developments that are characteristic of Europe itself. However, by the 19th century, late 19th century, Muslim authors are looking for an equivalent term. Many late 19th century Muslim artists are already now starting to paint in the European tradition using the canvas. They're coming under the sway and influence of European architectural forms, and they're coming under the influence of European philosophical ideas. And so, Ilm al-Jamal is chosen as a term, the science of beauty is chosen as a term or an equivalent to aesthetics. But this raises a whole series of very serious theoretical discussions. Can we translate a term like aesthetics, which carries such theoretical, conceptual baggage, from one cultural sphere to another that does not have the same intellectual history or cultural assumptions? Well, it didn't stop the scholars from translating the term, and it didn't stop many of the late 19th and early 20th century Muslim intellectuals of these parts of the world from becoming Europeanized. The graduates of these Dar al-Funun were by and large largely defined in their formation. They're defined by European intellectual history. And you get a new generation of thinkers and intelligentsia who are completely and utterly disconnected from the classical Islamic tradition. Now, despite the fact that there is a complete absence of an equivalent term to aesthetics in the Arabic language, nonetheless, we do find something quite interesting, as the author here points out in the entry to the Encyclopedia of Islam. Although the term aesthetics, Ilm al-Jamal, didn't exist, it's an invention, the notions and terms we often associate with aesthetics, like beauty, proportion, creativity, harmony, feelings, etc., aesthetic emotions and formal expressions, these individual items or topics or themes were discussed independently within the Islamic tradition. So you do find, for example, Ibn al-Haytham talking about harmony and proportion. I mean, that it is important in Islamic architecture and pattern design, for example. Beauty is discussed within theological and ethical contexts, for example. Creativity is discussed also, but they were never discussed as under a single umbrella or field of investigation. You find that they are often discussed in various different types of theological, philosophical, artistic, it's not artistic, sorry, cultural discussions, for example. And so this raises the question, if aesthetic is a problematic term itself, can we then speak of an Islamic aesthetics? And that's still a topic of discussion and debate today. Insofar as the Muslim world has adopted much of European cultural assumptions about this, Islamic aesthetics exist by default, in the sense that Muslims have already accepted the term aesthetics as a separate field of investigation, and Islamic aesthetics is by default something that exists as a field of investigation. However, and this is the opinion of many modernists and many scholars who embrace the adoption of the term. But however, for those who are more may perhaps take into account more of the classical understanding of Islam and the classical Islamic framework and perspectives, they may use the term with great caution, only because adopting this term means adopting an entire cultural frame of understanding the world that is alien to the classical Islamic tradition. And so these kind of debates continue till this day. As I said earlier, um, terms like pleasure, form, perception, creativity, art, color, harmony, proportion, imagination are discussed quite independently in the Islamic tradition, but then rarely ever lumped together under this field, this distinct field of knowledge. Why? Because when you think about it, beauty, al-hasan, and goodness, al-husn, for example, in the Arabic language, one relates to beauty of form, one relates to beauty of behavior or being or goodness, of ethics. They're interrelated, both etymologically speaking and in the theological and fiqh discussions, which means you can never really entirely separate beauty as form from beauty of being. That's just one simple example. And if you sever this connection, which was what happened in the European tradition, at least by the late 19th century, the questions of aesthetics and questions of beauty, sorry, questions of ethics and questions of beauty were separated. And beauty takes on an even more independent path of investigation, especially in the artistic world. All of you are familiar with modern art, perhaps already have observed the complete separation or divorce between artistic creativity and questions of moral goodness and ethics. So to accept aesthetics as a distinct field of investigation, one has to accept this kind of severance or disconnect of fields of knowledge and notions that within the classical Islamic understanding are interconnected and mutually dependent upon one another. However, as I said, Islamic aesthetics could be adopted as a term, and one then raises a series of other questions. For example, if one were to use the term aesthetics, then a helpful guide on how to use the term is this wonderful quote by Umberto Eco, where he says, "We must look for the ways in which a given period, in this case, the Islamic classical period, solved for itself aesthetic problems as they presented themselves at the time to the sensibilities and the culture of its people. Then our historical inquiries will be a contribution not to whatever we conceive aesthetics to be, but rather to the history of a specific civilization from the standpoint of its own sensibility and its own aesthetic consciousness." So there are some authors like Umberto Eco and many others who have investigated medieval understandings of art and beauty in the European tradition. And while they retain this notion of aesthetics in their vocabulary, what they've done is they've begun expanding the scope of the term aesthetics so as to properly reflect and fit the broader series of considerations and investigations that were central to, for example, a medieval understanding of beauty and art, rather than it being a contemporary imposition on medieval European thought. So, for example, instead of going into the British Museum in London and saying this object is, it's beautiful because it has a smooth texture and the incisions of the hieroglyphs are quite precise, that purely aesthetic, let's say, uh, formal appreciation or the appreciation of the pure form of the object is then replaced with questions like, how was this, within what context was this object understood and practiced and appreciated in ancient Egypt? What are the ritualistic practices? What is the worldview, let's say, the theology in which this was central? And how can then I can appreciate it on its own terms within that specific civilizational standpoint? And in that sense, then we're really exercising a certain measure of scholarly empathy, as it were, by bracketing out our own understandings um, and putting ourselves in the shoes of how other cultures and other periods looked and understood these terms. So then the adoption of the term aesthetics becomes a heuristic device in our historical inquiries and investigations, rather than a term that we then use and impose with a certain kind of specific meaning. So then these are two ways: either reject the term altogether, or you adopt it in one way or another, very sensitively, aware to these kind of important theoretical considerations. Now, this is a preliminary plunge into some of these questions and material. And when I mean classical period here, or classical Islam, I mean the period from roughly the 9th, 10th century to the 18th century period. And later, inshallah, later, I think over the summer when I deliver the more expanded lecture, I'll be looking at texts and individual figures from the 10th to 14th century specifically. So how do we approach the subject today? Given these theoretical challenges, there are a number of other issues to take into account and to consider. First of all, one might think, let's start with beauty in the Quran. The fount of all knowledge is the Quran in the Islamic tradition. So we start with an investigation of the Quran, because the Quranic worldview and Quranic understanding pours into every aspect of Islamic civilization. And when we begin to open up the Quran, and then also when we begin to open up the Arabic language and ask questions, what are the terms associated with beauty, for example? So if we restrict our investigation to the question of beauty itself, we'll find that the Quran begins to open up, and the Arabic language begin to open up a wide range of possible meanings that we can begin to explore. So one way of, let's say, approaching or answering the question, how did classical Muslims understand beauty? Well, that's a very broad question. Is to make it a bit more specific. How does the Quran itself, if we're going to investigate one term called beauty, not proportion or harmony or creativity, if we're going to take up one term, because the investigation has to be quite precise, if we take up one term and say, how does the Quran, for example, understand the notion of beauty? Because that will help us then understand how complex this term is and how interconnected it is with consideration that maybe today we don't associate with the term beauty anymore. So for those Muslim scholars who believe in a rooted revival, tajdid mu'assar, in the sense of let's try to recover how classical Islam and the Quranic understanding of things is, so that when we may then enrich our contemporary fields of investigation and contemporary thought, we have to then recover that complex interconnectivity of concepts and ideas and notions, the rich semantic field, and what is beyond that in the Quran. We can move on to also Arabic language. So in the Quran, we find the terms like Jamal used quite extensively. In Islamic theology, we find terms like Husn and Al-Hasan wal-Husn, or Husn as a root term. We find terms like Malih and Wasim associated with formal beauty, etc. And the investigation can go on quite extensively. If we focus exclusively on the Quran, for example, we'll find several references to the term Jamil, or beauty in the Quran, but with very strong ethical connotations. So, for example, here, beauty is associated with sabr, patience, for example. So any contemporary investigation of beauty today in the Western context, and even in the contemporary Islamic literature on, let's say, art and architecture, rarely ever discusses this ethical implication of beauty, for example. And do we have to accept this restricted understanding of beauty today? The Quran also uses beauty to refer to the formal beauty of a horse, for example. Right? You have also the notion of beauty as zina, so something that is added to something else in order to beautify it. We also have the notion of beauty associated with ornament of human ornament, and also ornament or beauty in nature. And we have also the notion of zina as vanity. So things that are not intrinsically beautiful may be beautified or made to appear beautiful to a certain soul, or to a certain perspective, and thereby it becomes a snare or a trap for the gaze, reducing its life or its existence to a purely material, superficial existence, right? So these are various uses of the term beauty or zina or zina. We also find Quran is very alert to the effect of beauty on the soul. And sometimes this effect is positive, sometimes this effect is negative, sometimes beauty draws us in and up towards God, sometimes it captures us like a prison, depending on what it is exactly. So here, typically in contemporary language, you would say, here the Quran is turning our attention to aesthetic emotions and feelings, which are, there's a huge field of investigation in contemporary aesthetics that has to do purely with the effect of beauty upon the soul or the psyche, right? So generally speaking, this is a very, very quick perspective here, but there's a wide range of possible understandings. And if you open up the commentaries also just on Jamal itself, you can come up with a wide range of, and this work hasn't been done yet, by the way. This work hasn't been done. And so if one were to ask the question, how does the Quran understand the notion of beauty? Then, well, the work has yet to be done, but you can see how complex it is just by following its uses of certain kind of terms, for example. That's one way of approaching it. So that's one challenge. If we start with the Quran, another major challenge to the field is, like I said earlier, because aesthetics wasn't a single field of investigation before the 19th century in the Islamic world. And that also applies, by the way, to Europe. Before the in the Middle Ages in Europe, the field of aesthetics didn't exist, very similar to the Islamic world. But you won't find a single text on aesthetics, for example. So what do you have to do? Well, you find yourself having to investigate all sorts of different sources in order to discover and piece together some kind of coherent picture. If you look at, for example, the classical texts on how to classify the sciences in the Islamic tradition, Iqsa and Tartib al-Ulum, for example, Al-Kindi places, for example, which is one of the earliest ones, places architecture and music, which we often associate with aesthetics purely. He puts them on the chapter on mathematics. Why? Because architecture and mathematics are governed by mathematical law. Sorry, architecture and music are governed by laws of proportion and harmony in mathematics. So these fall under mathematics, for example. You won't find a separate section for architecture. Whereas today, you would find them in books exclusively on aesthetics rather than mathematics. And if you go also to other writings, you will find separate discussions of poetry and music and architecture and writing and beauty discussed quite separately in Ikhwan Safa, Ibn Sina, and Ghazali. But you won't find them all lumped together under one field of investigation. So that's a challenge. The absence of a single work on this, so it means you have to really piece it together from various different sources. And these sources range from fiqh to kalam, to falsafa, to optics, to alchemy even, to writings and manuals written in workshops, artisanal workshops, to hisba manuals used by guilds, to all sorts of different references. And the scholar finds themselves quite overwhelmed with how to actually piece it all together. I've suggested over the years, I've suggested one particular way of, or potential way of approaching this rich body of material is to take one of three possible approaches to the sources. Either we consider a single school of thought, or, for example, one can say, what is a kalami approach to beauty, for example? Let's stick to beauty as our working example throughout the presentation to make it a bit more concrete. What's a kalami understanding of beauty, or any of the other correlata we discussed earlier, proportion, harmony, etc.? What's a kalami way of thinking about it? What's a falsafa way of thinking about it? What's a tasawwuf way? Because one can make the argument that kalam, falsafa, tasawwuf, fiqh are distinct schools of thought, or let's say distinct disciplines. Another way of approaching the sources is to say, what does a particular individual figure, like Ghazali, for example, have to say about this? Or one can make the argument that a thematic one, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. So if we were to take, for example, the school of thought, what does it mean to explore the question of beauty from the perspective of a discipline or a school of thought? For example, if one were to say, what do the philosophers say about beauty? What's a philosophical aesthetics? One can make the argument that there is such a thing as an Islamic philosophical aesthetics, because there is a distinct field of knowledge called falsafa. And such a discussion or investigation would have to start with a Neoplatonic distinction between intelligible beauty and sensible beauty, or the nature of love, poetic beauty, diction, and inspiration. And you find these discussed at length in Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina. There are some challenges to this approach because up until the point of Ghazali, it's a bit easy. But after Ghazali, many philosophical strands merge with many Sufi strands, and they kind of converge into a single current in individuals like Ibn Arabi and Suhrawardi, for example. However, one can still make the argument that there is a distinct Islamic philosophical aesthetics, for example. And for the Muslim philosophers, of course, all philosophical investigations end with the vision of God. And while it is an intellective journey by and large, it's a journey away from sensible beauty towards the vision of intelligible beauty. And under the influence of Plotinus, because although Plotinus was not known to Muslim philosophers by name, his writings, especially Enneads 4, 5, and 6, which do have detailed discussions on beauty, these were translated into Arabic, but wrongly titled The Theology of Aristotle. But nonetheless, the Enneads, or the sections of Plotinus's philosophy on beauty, which is exquisite and very Neoplatonic, these were the sections that were translated into Arabic for some reason. And so Muslims were very familiar with these kind of philosophical discussions of beauty in the Greek tradition. One could make the argument, as Oliver Leaman has, for example, that Suhrawardi is considered to be a philosophical mystic rather than a pure mystic or Sufi. And in that sense, he suggests that there is such a thing as an Ishraqi aesthetics, for example. And when one can make the argument that there's also a rational aesthetics or rationalistic aesthetics of Ibn Rushd. Sorry, that should be Ibn Rushd, not Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd. So one can make the argument and then investigate various figures within the broad school of Islamic philosophical aesthetics. There is also the school of or discipline called Kalam, and one can make a very convincing argument that there is an Islamic theological aesthetics. It's a bit complicated by the fact that Kalam engages with falsafa, fiqh, and tasawwuf, but one could, for example, pull out of Kalam's traditional theological discussions, unique discussions on the nature of the signs of God in nature, discussions about the attributes, the inimitability of the Quran, Ijaz al-Quran, for example, the dangers of sensuous pleasure, among other topics. And so you can find distinct topics of discussion related to, let's say, beauty, or related to one of the other themes we associate with aesthetics. We do find distinct discussions in Kalam that make it diverge from the philosophical school, for example. And also further discussions on, for example, the argument from design, the cosmological Kalam, cosmological argument from design, is one argument, for example, that can be read as a very interesting argument from aesthetics, if you will, as one author, contemporary author, has described it, because it talks about the intrinsic harmony and beauty and hikmah of the cosmos itself, both in its inward functioning and its outward manifestation. But the argument almost seems like an argument from beauty, as it were. Like I said, the discussions, theological discussions on husn and qubh of an action, the beauty and ugliness of an action, these raise some really interesting questions. And you'll notice that these are discussions that are very much rooted in ethics, right? So here, can you separate beauty from ethics? And the answer in the Islamic tradition is no, it's very difficult. The nature of language and meaning, so that relates to poetic diction, creativity, atomism, the early Maturidi discussion on hikmah in creation, which involved a discussion on the intrinsic harmony and beauty and order of the cosmos, etc. So there are many kind of theoretical speculations in Kalam that lend themselves well to what we might call today aesthetic considerations. The third distinct school of thought is tasawwuf, and one can easily make the argument in the writings of the mutasawwifa, in their discussions on beauty, love, perception, image, imagination, for example, Ibn Arabi, etc., the beauty of the human form, the inward and the outward, the psychology of beauty, which is discussed at length in Rusbihan Baqli, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, Suhrawardi, Ibn Arabi. this idea that all of creation is animated by divine love and manifests divine beauty, these are very rich sources of what we might call aesthetic reflections. But again, in each one of these distinct schools of thought, one has to ask oneself, how is it interconnected with other investigations? And how does then that undermine or alter our contemporary understanding of aesthetics itself? Okay, all right. So I have to move on because I'm moving at a pace that's a bit too slow. So there are many also other aspects in tasawwuf that lend itself to especially aesthetics of music and sama, the whirling dervish dance, the influence of certain Sufi or Sufi ideas on art in particular periods of Islamic in Islam, for example, also, so that investigation can expand quite considerably. Okay, all right. So, however, I've only looked at kalam, falsafa, and tasawwuf. One could make an argument that there is a literary theory of aesthetics in the writings of Al-Zahid, Qartajani, Jurjani, which is very different and distinct from Aristotle's Poetics, for example. One can discover and find very interesting aesthetics discussions in the writings of Jabir ibn Hayyan and alchemy, or on dream interpretation, especially on the notion of imagination and the perception of color and certain forms. Even fiqh, recently a scholar, Lebanese scholar, produced a book on Maliki fiqh discussions in the Maghrib on art. You'll find a lot of discussions, for example. Optics is another field. One can make the argument that there is a distinct, let's say, aesthetic field of investigation in the writings of Ibn al-Haytham and Kamal ad-Din al-Farisi, for example, right? And you can also, there are many other different fields of investigation. It's mind-boggling the amount of work that needs to be done in this field to arrive at. Now, I mentioned that there are three pathways to the sources. One is to look at distinct schools of thought, and we've covered that already. Another way is to say, well, instead of looking at distinct fields of knowledge and investigation, how about I pick up a figure like Ghazali and focus on one figure and say, for example, I'm going to look at how Al-Jahiz or Al-Ghazali discuss beauty or discuss whatever topic or theme I'm investigating. So in that sense, you will then have to work through a chronological sequence of the author's writings. If we look at Ghazali, for example, and you would have to look at all the things he has to say about, let's say, beauty, from his earlier writings to later writings, to piece together a certain understanding of what he had to say on the subject. You can also do the same with Ibn Arabi, for example. And I've been doing this lately with Ibn Arabi's works, for example. There are a lot of aesthetic themes in Ibn Arabi's writings. Sohrawardi, Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Haytham. Inshallah, over the summer period, when I see you again, I'll be giving concrete examples from Ibn al-Haytham, Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Arabi, and a few other figures. And I'll be illustrating each one of these approaches with very concrete examples and texts. So there's a challenge to the key figures because it takes almost a lifetime sometimes to come to grips with the writings of a single author. But there are numerous articles out there that already discuss, for example, Ghazali's understanding of beauty or Ghazalian aesthetics. Now, they're interesting investigations, but one has to be wary and careful and always keep in mind the kind of considerations I mentioned at the beginning. We don't want to fall into the trap of defining Ghazali's aesthetics by the limited purview of how we understand aesthetics today. Using the term aesthetics as a heuristic device, and by looking at the classical tradition, what we really want to do is try to reopen up the term aesthetics, which has been very considerably narrowed down in modernity, by reclaiming its rich, broad horizon of meaning and its links and connection to the other investigations of being that were typical of the medieval classical Islamic tradition. Of course, that's those amongst us who still value the more integrated, let's say, holistic view of reality that is characteristic of the classical tradition. There are many modernists today and postmodern Muslims who say, I'm not really interested in what the medieval Muslims had to say on this question. I really want to fully embrace a modernist and postmodern understanding of aesthetics. And they kind of nitpick and choose different ideas from different places. And they have adopted very contemporary Western definitions and terms. I find that very problematic, but people are free to choose the trajectory they want to go along. As long as لا نعنف التراث, we don't impose perspectives and views on the classical tradition and thereby misrepresent it. Okay, all right. So the third approach that I haven't really elaborated on enough is a thematic one. What do you mean by thematic? Well, one can make the argument that throughout the Islamic tradition, you'll find in various authors and various schools of thought certain themes that always pop up again and again. One can make the argument, for example, that the theme of the beauty of God comes up again and again in various sources, or the psychology of beauty, let's say, or creativity, al-ibda', or the human form, the nature of the human form. And particularly in the Islamic tradition, the question of the vision and the gaze, yeah, this is an important Islamic theme. So if one can identify such a theme, then the investigation would follow the following path. The theme becomes the uniting, overarching topic, and one then looks for various different authors and schools of thought that address this theme from different angles. And I've over the summer, I'll give you an example, inshallah, on proportion and harmony, light and color, well-being, health and beauty, and vision and the gaze. For example, vision and the gaze, there's a lot of literature in fiqh on nazar and looking, and the licit gaze and the illicit gaze, and that has serious ethical overtones. But then there's a lot of discussion also in nazar in optics. And there's also discussions on vision of God and vision of beauty in falsafa and tasawwuf. So you can see how the gaze and vision are interconnected within in a certain way. And there's also a relationship of vision and the gaze and the veil, the veiling of beauty, the veiling of the feminine. So these are kind of overarching themes that can be explored within the Islamic tradition by drawing on a variety of different authors and schools of thought. So the thematic approach then is an overarching theme that seems to be quite common in the Islamic tradition over time and over a wide range of different authors and schools of thought. So this is the third possible approach. And there are many, many other themes, of course, but these are the ones that I think I found quite dominant. And there are several others. I'd be interested and to find out more from you, what you think. Some other considerations, some other themes, for example, and the one that's actually central in contemporary discussions is the theme of the image, for example, or the ban of the image. This is something that has a defining distinction or difference between Western art and Islamic art. Why is this the case? And my own investigations have led me to believe that it's much more complicated than just the question of, well, let me rephrase it. For a very long time, Western understandings of Islamic art were that Islam banned the image, and so Muslim artists had to focus exclusively on decoration and ornamentation. We now know, for example, that that's not correct. Well, it's partially correct, but that ornate surfaces, decorative surfaces are much more complex artistically and aesthetically, and they form a distinct aesthetic system from the aesthetic system of images. Right. So in the Islamic tradition, you find an aesthetic system developing that's radically different from what's happening in the European tradition with its focus on the image. It's not no less sophisticated, it's just something radically different. And this is captured by the quote of Hans Belting in his book Florence at Baghdad, which is quite a good book on this subject. The Islamic world, geometry became a symbolic form by being a subject of representation, as opposed to a tool for representation, as in the West. So what is an aesthetic system that takes geometry as a subject of representation? And what's an aesthetic system that takes geometry as a tool for representation, especially from the Renaissance onwards in the Western tradition? And my own investigations have shown that the ban on the image in Islam is intrinsically related to a very deep and profound philosophical and spiritual aspect of the nature of Islam, as opposed to other religious traditions. So it's not just a ban and then Muslim artists were restricted to just doing ornament. It's a lot more complicated than that. And the reason why this is important is because we have to stop looking at, let's say, Islamic art, architecture, and these questions from the perspective of negativity. It's the absence of images only. No, it's a distinct aesthetic system with its own considerations. The same way that we can't say the two-dimensional symmetrical form of Egyptian art lacks naturalism and realism. Well, the Egyptians never intended to produce forms and images that were three-dimensional or naturalistic or realistic. The real question is not why didn't they develop perspective, which many Europeans consider to be the pinnacle of art, and that's a very Eurocentric perspective. The real question is, what were they trying to achieve by using symbolic two-dimensional symmetrical forms? And what the answer is that exactly what they were trying to achieve was only achievable in two-dimensional symmetrical symbolic form. Realistic naturalistic art did not lend itself, and we now know, for example, that they did have the capacity to do perspective. They just chose not to. So that's an important consideration. So the question then becomes also for the Islamic tradition: what is it that Islamic art or architecture is doing on its own terms, rather than look at it as the opposite of European art, as a negation, that it lacks images, right? No, we have to look at it as what is it as a distinct aesthetic system. Okay, all right. So now there are several possible new fields of investigation today that are trying to take a deeper look at Islamic art, architecture, and aesthetics. I mentioned the book Hans Belting, Florence and Baghdad. There are a few other authors out there that are exploring. I just want to mention it here. I don't necessarily agree with their approaches necessarily, but they are raising some interesting questions and bringing out some interesting observations about the nature of Islamic art as a distinct aesthetic system. There's the work of Oleg Grabar, who draws on psychoanalysis, Valery Gonzalez, who draws on phenomenology, and Laura Marx, who draws on Deleuzian ontology. And each one of these is revealing some interesting insights about the distinct uniqueness of Islamic art in its ornamental and geometric forms. Okay, I think that's the end of it. Right on time, alhamdulillah. So if there are any questions you might have, Bismillah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmoud, for this for this fascinating lecture. I think I especially enjoyed personally very much the fact that you are going beyond this concept of aesthetics, which of course arises in a particular historical context and may not necessarily be applicable to all other contexts, and instead by trying to somehow to understand how as you said, the traditional, the Islamic tradition thought about these things, and maybe use that to reinterpret the meaning or expand the meaning of aesthetics in the modern sense. The one question that comes to mind, and it's actually seems to be closely related to the first question that was posted, is how you've outlined three methods for thinking about beauty and aesthetics: school of thought, key figures, and thematic approach. But I wonder, what about an approach that would actually look at concrete traditions, artistic traditions, crafts or arts, and maybe calligraphy or architecture, and then using those to abstract or deduce the principles behind them that motivate these arts, and building from that, building a kind of theory or understanding of the meaning of beauty. And that's my iteration. I'm just going to read, to be fair to the person that posed a similar question, I think Adil Iqbal Salem. Can you comment on the relationship between Islamic aesthetic beauty and material cultures, especially crafts and embodied knowledge?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you look at if you take the schools of thought, for example, um, you can easily devise, or not schools of thought, but let's say fields of investigation. You can easily say that there are distinct ways of discussing these questions among the artisans. So it wouldn't be a third different approach or fourth different approach. It would be actually a subcategory of one of them. Or if you look at a particular author within that, then it would be a particular key figure, for example. Or if you were to look at an overarching theme that's quite dominant among artisans, then it would be a theme. So you can increase those sub themes and subcategories endlessly. The problem with this approach, or not the problem, the challenge of this approach is, and this is something I think one of the defining things of contemporary, one of the reasons why a lot of contemporary, especially Western Islamic art historians and architectural historians insist that Islamic art architecture is purely a material culture, is because we don't have a wide availability of manuscripts and text that concretely link buildings to concepts and ideas. And given that the fact that Islamic art and architecture is a field that was initiated and started by archaeologists, there is a bias in favor of a purely material approach to the question. And it's changing. It's changing, but but it doesn't change the reality of the absence of a lot of primary sources, which doesn't mean that we can't make that link. They can be made. It's just that not enough people, I think, are working in the field. It's important to bear in mind that a significant chunk, if not the majority, of Islamic knowledge is still in manuscripts in libraries that is unpublished. So we have no idea what's in there in the Sulaimaniya or in the Zahiriya in Damascus or whatever it is, what texts can be possibly found that discuss these issues. We do have Hisba manuals, for example. So Hisba manuals were manuals developed and written by Muhtasib. The Muhtasib is someone who monitored markets, monitored craft guilds, and made sure that they performed up to certain kind of standards. We do have some references to or some text by artisans and craftsmen, but they're very rare and far and wide in between. But definitely that is something that can be done. It's just number one, there's a lack of a lot of sources. Number two, very difficult to access them because they're still in manuscript form. They're definitely a legitimate approach.
Yes, and I would really actually, in fact, second your observation. I've been looking into calligraphy for the past few years, and it's very rare indeed to find to find a text that tries to abstract some of the concepts. And the one that I did find, called Kalem Güzeli, written in the, I think, believe early or mid 20th century in Turkish, he says very explicitly he's writing that book because no one writes about it. And if you ask a calligraphy master, he'll just say, go and practice calligraphy and you'll understand.
Yeah.
So it's a much more experiential approach.
It is. It's
It.
embodied knowledge.
Yeah.
It's very much a lot of this knowledge was never committed to writing. It's embodied, it's known, it's handed down from master to disciple. You will find more text toward the later period, after the 15th century, less text before that period.
Well, thank you. Another question that was raised: where should we start to read about and learn about Islamic aesthetics?
There are a number of. I mean, it's an emerging field. To be honest, it's only been around for the past 15, 20 years, because the field of Islamic art, architecture, aesthetics, if you will, was largely dominated by a very material approach until very recently. There's a new field, I wouldn't say a new field, but scholars are converging on a field of knowledge called Islamic Aesthetics and Visual Culture. And Islamic Aesthetics and Visual Culture looks at um, uh, texts and aesthetic sensibilities over various periods of time, and not necessarily at specific monuments and buildings. And that's an emerging field with a number of authors writing in this area. There are one or two texts that are good introductions, I think, um, but there's not a lot out there. I mentioned, for example, earlier here, Oleg Grabar, Gonzalez, for example, have interesting discussions. There's a recent book written by an author called, what's her name? Anna Sharp, I think. No. Anyway, it's called Award. It's called What is Islamic Art, which is a very interesting book. And there's also a book by Hans Belting that begins to look into these kind of questions. Florence and Baghdad. Gonzalez's book is called Beauty and Islam. That's also a good book. I think that's a good book to start with. But there aren't that many out there, unfortunately. There aren't that many out there. Oliver Lehman wrote a book called Islamic Aesthetics and Introduction, and it's kind of a polemical text where he interrogates the concept, mainly drawing on literary and philosophical circles. I don't agree with a lot of what he says in there, but it's one of the few books out there that exists. But there is a growing number of PhD theses on aesthetics, Ibn Arabi, aesthetics, Mustafa Wardi, and yeah.
Thank you. One other question. Do you think that Islamic aesthetics should be a contemporary theoretical field on its own, not necessarily as a subject of historical inquiry? If so, what sort of questions should be pursued in this field?
Oh, that's a big scholarly question. I'm wary of it. I'm wary of modernists and postmodernists taking the term and running with it without radically interrogating it. I use it for heuristic purposes, and I try to use it very carefully. Let me give you an example from an analogous field. Can one say, can one, with a clear conscience, say, we want to use our contemporary understanding of reason and run with it? It raises a lot of serious questions because the very notion of contemporary reason or ratio is radically distinct and different from classical understanding of reason. It's very reductionist. It's very materialist. It doesn't take, for example, a maratib perspective on reality, for example. So contemporary understandings of that don't take into account the levels of reality, maratib al-wujud, the different levels of knowledge, maratib al-ulum, and the different levels of methodology, maratib al-usul. And within that scope, you find reason is usually understood in a positivistic, reductionist, materialistic sense. But what do I do with that term? Do I just abandon it altogether? Or do I say, perhaps one way of approaching it is to say, let's use the term, but let's try to expand its scope or re-expand its scope to a point where it can overlap more considerably with an earlier, more expansive, more integrated understanding of what this means. Because in my opinion, my personal opinion, any contemporary investigation into the question of aesthetics is not a question of accepting a Western term and running with it, but rather we're trying to reconstruct and revive a more nuanced, more complex understanding of reality, aesthetics and beauty being one of them. And in the process, help rehabilitate and heal the fissures and division that have happened in thought and culture since the 18th, 19th century, which have led to the kind of disastrous consequences we're living through right now. So for me, it's really a very conscious engagement with the term, but trying to restore the integrity, breadth of vision, and the ta'sil, the rootedness in the classical Islamic tradition. At least that's how I approach it, and that's how I do it. Many people in the field couldn't care less about these questions and considerations. But for myself, I think humanity needs a new voice and this kind of global conversation on the nature of reality, on the nature of what beauty is, nature of ethics. And we can do so quite powerfully. We have a very distinct and very unique, very integrated, very powerful vision to reclaim and bring into the conversation. And so these considerations for me become quite paramount. Not let's develop this field called aesthetics and then set up university departments and funding that exclusively funds people to do modernist and postmodernist works of art and analyze them within a very restricted understanding of reality. For me, I couldn't care less about that particular direction, although that's what's happening across the Islamic world, unfortunately. My direction is very, very different. It's the ihya. It's one that's rooted in principles. It's one that believes that in the strength of a classical perspective that can then engage with the best of what contemporary knowledge has to offer, but rooted in principles, not the other way around, which is what tends to happen today.
Very good, thank you. I don't see any further questions, but if I may be permitted to ask a question, since you managed images and that's a complicated subject, of course. I wonder, it sort of occurs to me that within the span of Islamic history, there appears to be a shift, for lack of a better term, when we see the appearance of Turkic-dominated formations and then art that's produced, we see a proliferation of images in the Turco-Persianate sphere, however one wants to call it, as opposed to the previous parts of Islamic history where images are not really that widespread. And do you have any thoughts on this? Is there some kind of deeper connection with peoples and or ethnicities and cultures and so on?
Yes, there is. I mean, it's a known fact that in Persian-speaking and Turkic-speaking lands, the absolute ban on the image was less of a ban than it was in other areas, especially in Arabic-speaking areas. And what you find across the entire Islamic world is there is a ban on representing God. That's definitely there. And there's a very strong reluctance to represent the Prophet ﷺ, although sometimes at some point it does appear, especially in Turkic and Persian-speaking lands. And that has to do with the particular cultures, ethnicities, and their own cultural repertoire and own cultural imagination, if you will, which Islam found room for within its broad diversity. But you'll find that even where it was used, it was never used within the context of places of worship. So you do have a universal ban on the image or representation of God, and to a certain extent of the Prophet, and in all places of worship. So that was kind of universally constant to a large extent, especially the first one, the ban on the image of God. But beyond that, in manuscripts, in illuminated manuscripts, it's important to bear in mind that every Muslim today can look at illuminated manuscripts, but in the past these had a very restricted audience. So these were either in courts or private collections, and so it didn't affect the public consumption of images necessarily. They were restricted within certain kind of circles. But I think that's part of the beauty of Islam, even in later cultures where periods where it spreads into Southeast Asia and Africa. The way in which it allows the preservation of certain cultural traditions of images within a certain scope is quite interesting. And I think we can draw a lot of lessons from that.
Well, very good. Thank you very much. And our thanks to our listeners today and the organizers of İLEM Istanbul Talks.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for listening. And thanks for having me. And inshallah, I'll be seeing you soon. Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.